Hi, everybody. Welcome to our webinar on COP29. We're going to be discussing the prospects for climate finance and for landing a new deal on climate finance, a new climate finance goal in Baku, which is starting in just under 2 weeks' time. This is very clearly a COP at which finance is taking center stage. This has been said many times by the COP29 presidency and also by the UN climate chief, Simon Steele, and that this new climate finance goal is supposed to be the main deliverable from this annual UN climate conference in Baku. Simon Steele, UN climate chief, has said in his speeches recently that this needs to be an enabling COP. And by that, he's mainly talking about finance, which is going to pay for the climate action that we so desperately need. He's also called it the stand and deliver COP. So clearly he wants to see a strong result on climate finance. And why is that important? Well, our panelists will explain that to everybody as we go along. It is basically in order to be able to allow countries to plan for ambitious action on renewable energy, cutting their emissions, adapting to the worsening climate impacts that we're seeing, and hopefully dealing with the loss and damage that's coming along with those worsening droughts, floods, storms, and so on. But we're talking about a lot of money that is required. A recent report estimated, looking at the needs of around 100 developing countries, that the amount of money they would need for their new national climate action plans is going to be something around, let's say, around 500 billion a year, leading up to 2030. And the levels of climate finance that we've been seeing up to now have been about a fifth of that. So there's a lot of work to be done. And the negotiations, as you can imagine, as you know, have been very tricky. And, you know, they have been stalling on things like the amount of money for the new climate finance goal and who's going to pay towards the new climate finance goal. And because this is such a key issue that really needs to be sorted out at this COP, we're going to spend this whole webinar discussing the ins and outs of this one big topic that needs to be fixed in Baku. So we will get going on the discussion. I'll introduce myself first. I'm the editor of Climate Home News. I think you all know what Climate Home News does. We focus on the international politics of the climate crisis. And to us, COPs are super important. They're central to everything we're reporting on with the UN climate talks, and we will be there on the ground bringing you the news and the developments. I will introduce our panelists and then we will kick off the discussion. What we'll do is I will ask our panelists some questions and then we'll have a follow-up conversation between ourselves. We'll invite our listeners, you guys, to put your questions in the Q&A box. If you accidentally put them in the chat, we'll try and get them from there as well. So feel free, please, to contribute your questions at any time during the discussion, and I will pick those up and put those to our panelists. If you'd like to specify the particular panelist that you'd like to answer the question, please feel free to do that. Otherwise, I'll just pick whoever seems to fit best. So I'll introduce our panelists. We have Dr. Sandra Guzman Luna. She is the founder and general coordinator of the Climate Finance Group for Latin America and the Caribbean. That's called GFLAC. Which is the acronym for its name in Spanish. Sandra is an ecofeminist, a climate activist, and an international specialist in low carbon development and climate finance. She was previously the General Director of Policies for Climate Change at the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources of Mexico, which I think is known as SEMARNAT. Then we have Li Shuo. Li is Director of the China Climate Hub at the Asia Society Policy Institute and a Senior Fellow with its Center for China Analysis. So his work focuses on analysing China's environmental and energy policies and supporting the international community's engagement with China's climate agenda. And before working with the Asia Society Policy Institute, Lee has more than a decade of experience working on UN environmental negotiations, from climate change to biodiversity, oceans, plastic pollution, and ozone. Then we have Mikai Robertson. Mikai is a senior advisor on finance to the chair of AOSIS, which is the Alliance of Small Island States, and is directly involved in the climate finance negotiations. He's also a research fellow at ODI in the climate and sustainability program there. He's an experienced specialist and practitioner in national and international environmental law, policy and governance. And the main focus of his work is on finance and financial systems, especially on climate change, ocean governance and biodiversity. And then we have Joe Thwaites, who's a senior advocate for international climate finance with the Natural Resources Defence Council. He works on international climate policy to scale up funding for developing countries, shift finance to align with the Paris Agreement goals, and reform international financial institutions to be more effective and equitable in supporting climate action. Joe has got more than 15 years of experience working on international climate policy, including at the World Resources Institute and Adelphi. So as you've heard there, we've got some absolutely brilliant climate finance specialists to talk about this key issue today. And yeah, we'll start with Joe. Obviously, these negotiations on the new climate finance goal have been going on for some time now, and things have really ramped up this year. Can you give us an overview, please, Joe, of how things have progressed and some of the key moments that have brought us to where we are now?
Yeah, thank you, Megan. Thank you for having me, and thank you for putting together this brilliant panel. It's great to support Climate Home News as well. So yeah, the first thing to say is this goal has been known about for almost a decade now. The mandate came through in Paris at the same time as the Paris Agreement was adopted, and the mandate was that prior to 2025, the Conference of the Parties, serving as the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement, shall set a new collective quantified goal from a floor of $100 billion a year, taking into account the needs and priorities of developing countries. And so for several years after that decision was adopted in Paris, there was discussions about when those negotiations would begin in earnest. In 2018 in Katowice, they agreed that they would start those negotiations at COP26. That got delayed, obviously, by the pandemic. So in 2021 at COP26, the formal negotiations on the new collective quantified goal began. And they created a ad hoc work program, a three-year work program, and mandated a number of different things, including an annual high-level ministerial dialogue, as well as each year 4 technical expert dialogues. And those technical expert dialogues are not formal negotiating sessions. They were areas where government, civil society, private sector actors, international institution representatives could all get together and sort of talk on an equal basis. There was sort of like breakout groups, a little bit like university seminars, and it was a really helpful discussion, but it wasn't a negotiation. And we got to COP28 last year, and I think sort of the panic started to set in a little bit. Of we're 2/3 of the way through this 3-year process. We've got a year left, and we've been having these nice discussions, but they've been somewhat circular in nature, and that we need to actually get down. Governments need space to actually focus on what the decision text will look like. So in Dubai at COP28, they agreed to step up the work and create, in addition to the technical expert dialogues, proper sessions of the ad hoc work program where governments alone are engaging in substantive negotiations. And so there were 3 sessions this year. The first one was in Cartagena in April, and in that session the co-chairs of the process, Fiona Gilbert and Zahir Fakir, sought inputs from everyone. They said, look, we've had 2 years of discussions, we've taken those into account. Tell us your thoughts on what you would like to see in the decision. And all the governments sort of read in different ideas, and they collated all of those and put them together in an input paper that was 65 pages long and included everything. And for those of you who followed the Paris process, you'll be familiar with that. That was similar to the Geneva text in early 2015. Just everything under the sun was there. That was created ahead of the Bonn session. At the Bonn session in June, the government said, well, this is great. There's a lot here. It's also completely incoherent. It's unmanageable. It's really, really long. Can you streamline it? Can you remove duplications? Can you sort of group issues together and make it more coherent? So they did that, and they did 2 rounds of that during the Bonn session. Really heroic work from the Secretariat and the co-chairs. And they got this paper down from 65 pages to, I think, 35 pages. But it was still that's way too long. This decision is going to be a few pages. So they said to the co-chairs and secretariat, please go away ahead of the Baku session, which was in early September, come back with another more streamlined paper. And I think the one that they released ahead of Baku was 12 pages, something like that. So got it down again. And there's still a lot of square brackets. For those of you who follow the negotiations, you know that when there's stuff in square brackets, there's disagreements. There's options in the text. There will be a paragraph and it will say option 1, option 2, option 3. There was even a table with different packages for the big issue of the number and the structure of the goal. And those are all online. Anyone can go and read them. And in Baku, they got further inputs of what countries liked, what they didn't like, and they also used the TED to sort of generate ideas on like what are the solutions here. Like everyone's sort of setting out their positions, but are there ways to sort of bridge the gaps? And so in the technical expert dialogue, which was a little bit unusual, you actually had a situation where people were sort of going, discussing how to like group paragraphs or bridge different ideas. And that was all fed into the co-chairs. And then their mandate, which was given in Dubai, was to a month ahead of the COP, 4 weeks ahead of the COP, to produce a substantive framework for a draft negotiating text. And they released that, I think it was on October the 14th. And that, again, that's on the website. Anyone can look at it. They got it down to 9 pages, so a few more pages down. There are still big differences. What has also happened since the Baku session in early September is that the discussions have really elevated to a higher, more political level. So all this year it's been happening at the technical negotiator level with the sort of real deep government experts on these issues, including Mikhail. But they've also, starting at the UN General Assembly, discussions started to kick into this higher level where you got ministers and more senior representatives engaging on the text, and that's sort of brought to the fore some of the most political issues, like the contributor base, like the actual quantum and the structure. And they've been able to sort of, a lot of that's not happened in public view, but they've been able to engage in more frank conversations. So that's really where we are now. There was the pre-COP, the high-level ministerial dialogue, which I know Mikhail was at. We have the framework for the text. COP starts in less than 2 weeks' time. And so I think we've come a long way. We've got down to 9 pages. There's still a lot of stuff up in the air, but the political leaders are really starting to get engaged. And I think the other thing that's really interesting is that, the lead ministries for the UN negotiations on climate tend to be environment and climate ministries. But what's happened in the last month is we've had a series of meetings bringing together finance ministers and climate ministers, and that's been really important because at the end of the day, who is in charge of the financial decisions? It's the finance minister or even the head of state. And so getting them in the room and getting their heads around this very technical process is really important for a good outcome.
Thanks ever so much, Joe. I think that's a really comprehensive sort of countdown to where we are at the moment. And I think also it's very useful because sometimes, especially when media are writing about these issues, there tends to be a sort of we have to say that they haven't made progress on this, and there's been, for example, in Bonn, there seemed like there'd been very little progress. But in actual fact, it's incremental, right? Isn't it? You have to go through all of these steps and you have to sort of deal with multiple issues at once. And I think, the very fact they've gone from having this text that was like literally full of absolutely everything to something that's more targeted, although it's not yet a draft text for negotiation. I guess it's like the pre-draft text. Goes to show that work has been yielding some fruit. So Mika, you were at the pre-COP, which is basically the main gathering of officials and ministers before the actual COP itself. And coming out of that, there was talk about at least some kind of level of, if not sort of formal agreement, but a kind of coming together on the idea that the climate finance goal would be what they call multi-layered, or sort of perhaps other people have called it looking like an onion, with a core and then different types of finance to sort of make it bigger and bigger. That's not a very scientific description from me, but perhaps you can basically fill us in a little bit on what was the feeling like in Baku last time, and what did people feel that they had actually kind of come away with in terms of progress of those finance talks?
Yeah, sure, no problem. Thanks, Megan, and I'm happy as I come after Joe, who provided us with a masterclass in the new climate finance goal. So that was really helpful. I do think if we're squarely looking at the pre-COP, the discussions were primarily, as you alluded to, on the structure of the goal. Yeah, it's interesting because the concept of multi-layer is arguably so it's a politically toxic kind of word, phrase, because of the grouping of countries that it came from, right? So we do have to bear that in mind. But even the context of the current goal, there are two core components of it, right? Which you can arguably say are two layers, right? But the main thing is that there is that kind of understanding, that precedent that was set with the current goal, whereas that we talk about provision, which is from developed to developing, and then mobilization through public interventions made by developed countries. And then this other layer is kind of the discussion that's being had, which is called the global investment target. And then there's obviously linking to that contributing to the different layers, which didn't end up being kind of a detailed technical discussion on. And then as well, how do you kind of track and hold people accountable for the different layers? So one thing that I wouldn't necessarily say that it was coherence or converging. To be honest, my personal perspective, it was more of, at least as well from the grouping that I do assist, it's questioning, right? It's questioning and teasing out whether this idea is, first of all, feasible, and also why is this idea only coming right now? Is a huge question that we all have to have, right? The kind of the proliferation of the idea of this global investment target was informally done in June in Bonn. And then it only reached onto paper in August by different developed country colleagues. The issue with that is that it means even on the developed side, it's structured in various different ways on the developed side, right? So I've been referencing it a lot, and a colleague from Singapore, he first mentioned it. I think there's the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once. And I think that really encapsulates the concept of the global investment target, sadly, right now, because you have on kind of the far extreme of its articulation, it's about all investment flows, domestic, international, public and private, right? So then the initial questions that we had, trying to operate in good faith, right, in these discussions is first of all, whose investments, right? And how do you then hold them accountable? Because we're setting a target, right? Where are these investments going to reside, right? Because currently there's some parties with the global investment target that want it to sit attract developed to developing flows as well, in addition to develop and developing, as well as developing to developing. So it's a lot of issues there. Then there's a discussion on tracking. How do you track the progress towards this? Noting that it might be everything in the kitchen sink, right? And it's huge issues as well there, because those who highlight the global investment target as an option, they say that the biennial assessment can provide the tracking that is needed. However, we question that. We question that because the biennial assessment, while it is a good report, on the context of flows beyond those that are traditionally known in relation to 100 billion, you're going into using reports, methodologies that are externally decided by think tanks that are, outside of the process, as opposed to it being based on a finance and tracking system in the UNFCCC, using reports coming from developed countries. Using reports coming from parties in general, right? Specifically developed countries. And then there's a discussion on what is the numerical target linked to this global investment goal. Global investment target. No one has articulated that, and the methodology that they use for that, right? And it has kind of been used as this antithesis to when developing countries call for trillions in public financing. It's used as, that's ridiculous. So the real pragmatic thing is to call it a global investment target and kind of have this as, being everything in the kitchen sink, which then you can count as trillions because it's already trillions if you look at it in the context of what is tracked for everything. And the last thing is, no one has clearly articulated if there is an importance of having this core provided and mobilized, similar to how the current goal is structured. What then is the link to the global investment target in the context of supports for developing countries for their needs and priorities? That is massively missing in the context of this global investment target narrative. I think more specifically focused on, in the context of SIDS, small and developing states and LDCs, we get lost, completely lost, when you can't talk about investments in the traditional paradigm and way that people understand investments to be, because we're just too small. The economies are not attractive to those who typically have the stocks and flows to invest. And so there's so many different questions that we engaged with. And so less of kind of the convergence as may have been portrayed, but more of just questioning and realizing that we need to focus on step by step. First of all, understanding the core, and that we flesh out in at this COP, and maybe the discussion on the global investment target has to be had at another time, right? But I think, in order to understand that there's no clear legal basis in the Paris Agreement, at least from my interpretation on it, to kind of discuss this. However, there is the kind of like broader forums that talk about finance flows more generally. And can we have a discussion about that in that forum, as opposed to connecting it to a goal that is meant for supporting developing countries, in particular SIDS and LECs. And so just I guess the last thing to highlight is that what wasn't a huge amount of time wasn't spent on was on the qualitative elements, which if you look at the lessons from the current goal, it was absolutely just absent. It's just there was really no clear qualitative elements on things that talk to access, right? And how do you do it beyond just saying, yes, enhance access, but enhance access in this way by this date, and then report back to us on how you're doing this in the context of the different channels of climate finance. So there is that. As well as have to highlight that from a small and developing state and least developed country standpoint, having and we've been pushing for respective floors in the context of trillions or hundreds of billions, whatever we decide on, because we are not competitive enough right? And we don't have the size and the scale that is needed to attract even public finance, right? We need to have just a baseline assurance because we're not able to take up for sure the hundreds of billions or the trillions, but we at least need to move from places where SIDS are only getting 2%. 2% of even that measly 100 billion. It's quite sad. So we do need to move from that and make sure that the concessionality is also a huge area where we need to unpack in the context of making sure things are below market rates. Because if you are engaging in financing that is the same as the market rate, why do we need to put it in the context of a goal under the international regime to talk to parties? Then you would just go out to the private sector, right?
Yeah.
But however, there's huge issues with that. But noting as well that the last thing is on transparency and the system, because where everyone at least is understanding that the UNFCCC system is the basis, both developer and developing. But how then, noting that there are biannual reports, and we are already accustomed as a global community to annual kind of reporting and tracking of progress, how do we bridge that divide? So the need for these annual updates in the interim are very important, as well as making sure that you have reporting in the context of this access enhancement by the various different channels. And the last thing would be is to because the discussions of the progress report being done by the Standing Committee on Finance, but at least personally, I would say that we need to maybe step away from a forum that, ideally should have been a technical body, but it had become very political, right? And so it might be best, similar to the NDC annual report, to also have now the progress being done by the Secretariat and not really with parties involved. Noting how political this is, it's for the Secretariat to just deal with this and just add up the numbers, present it to us, and then when we come at the CMA or the COP, then we decide on it. So I'll stop there, Megan. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mika. I think that's, obviously what you've highlighted there really pulls out and draws on some of the problems that were experienced with the previous 100 billion goal, which, just to remind people, was met 2 years late, and there were so many problems around definitions and who was measuring the numbers and how those numbers were measured, and it's caused a lot of mistrust within the whole UN climate process, which I think the new climate finance goal would ideally address. And the fact is also that that 100 billion just isn't anything like enough, and hence we've also had this discussion around broadening the contributor base. And I want to bring in Lee at this point, because what developed countries have been saying for quite some time now is that they want some of the higher emitting, richer developing countries to also contribute towards this core public finance that would go to, small island developing states and least developed countries that just can't access the markets like Mika was saying, or they get a very small percentage of overall climate finance. And, everybody knows, I think, that unless China is on board with the arrangements for the new climate finance goal, that there probably won't be a new climate finance goal. And the reason for that is that, developed countries are very sort of obviously, but without always saying it, although they do sometimes say it, making it clear that they want China to be one of the contributors to the new climate finance goal under the section for governments. And Lee, you've just been in Beijing. Can you sort of talk us through, what the mood is on the Chinese side when it comes to China being a potential contributor, and whether there's any kind of room for maneuver? Because what we hear at the climate talks in public is that it's very much like China doesn't want to be added to the pot along with other wealthy governments. Could you explain a bit the dynamics of what's going on there? Thanks.
Sure. Thanks very much, Megan, for having us. Let me begin by saying I still find NCQG, after all these years, one of the most difficult acronyms within the UNFCCC, and it is certainly one of the most challenging issues that we need to deal with in the history of the UNFCCC. Look, I think what underlines this challenge is really this essential question: we are almost a decade after the adoption of the Paris Agreement. And our country is still committed as they were 10 years ago, to the agreement, to that collaborative, cooperative spirit that we had. I think there's really no straight answer to this question. Otherwise, Baku will be smooth sailing. And I think it is also very important to realize that just beyond the negotiations in Baku, there are a lot of geopolitical turbulences that will inform the country positions in Baku. The hot wars that are happening in the world, the U.S.-China tension, and related also to the new contributor base issue, the historical deficit when it comes to developed countries, climate finance delivery. And of course, adding on top of that, we are also expecting the U.S. election in a few days. All of this, I think, will inform, if not directly shape, the contour of the NCQG deal. I think just on China specifically, of course, one of the most important considerations for the country is whatever agreement that we reach in Baku, it cannot be seen as renegotiating the Paris Agreement, in particular, the Article 9 of that agreement. And of course, from a Chinese point of view, the principle that really underlines that particular article is the idea or the concept that when it comes to providing climate finance, developed countries, should take the lead. The other thing, of course, is, and this is where I hope there will be more political space for China to do more. There's also the idea that other countries will also join this effort. So we would end up with a collectively raising to the top dynamic. I think that would be a very ideal place to be at the end of COP29. And look, in terms of the final agreement, the final deal, very much in line with the Paris Agreement and this Article 9, we should expect sort of a hodgepodge of obligations that are common, and some of the other obligations or provisions that would feature differentiated responsibilities. And of course, the key issue here is what are the provisions that will need to be common and what are the provisions that need to be differentiated. And it's worth thinking about some of the key provisions and elements that we are anticipating in the NCQG package. As others have already mentioned, the quantum, sort of the structure of the NCQG package. Do we have thematic focuses, the contributor base issue, the time frame of the targets or goals, and the transparency mechanism and revision mechanisms. So how will commonality and differentiation be enshrined through all those provisions? I think will be a very, very important issue. And the other thing that I would say from a Chinese point of view is I think a lot of people probably fail to realize or appreciate what the country has been doing actually when it comes to providing climate or climate-related finance. I just want to highlight a recent report done by the World Resource Institute, taking into account a few sources of finance: bilateral climate finance, export credits, countries' contribution into MDBs, and private finance mobilized. If you put all these four sources together, WRI's conclusion is between the year 2013 and 2022, on an annual basis, China has provided $4.5 billion per year of climate finance to other developing countries. And this represents about 6% of the entire global climate finance during that same period. So, and this also puts China on par with some of the developed countries have been doing. I think very much on par with the UK. So China is not a neglectable climate finance contributor. That's good news. We should recognize that. And I think that also raises one very important question, which is how do we leverage that to create an NCQG package that would actually facilitate countries like China to do more, to contribute more, to help other global South countries. And this is also, I guess, my last message. And that is, out of all the political turbulence that we will see in Baku and the fierce debates and fights, we need to keep one thing in mind, which is this whole NCQG exercise at the end of the day is about getting more net climate finance, in particular to climate vulnerable countries. Sometimes politics or pressure will get into the way in achieving that goal. So how do we balance, the politics behind this and the real goal that we need to achieve? That's something that we should always think about.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's not going to be an easy task to do that by any means. But I want to go to Sandra now to ask her view on why is it so important that this challenge is met and that we do end up, as Mikhail and Lee have basically said, with more finance flowing to where it's most needed. Why is it needed, Sandra? And what kinds of things is this finance going to be facilitating, especially from your point of view, sitting in Latin America?
Thank you so much, Megan. I hope you can hear me. And thanks a lot for the colleagues to put in every single piece in place to start kind of like also debating what is possible. I would like to go back and really reflect about why this NCQG, this new collective goal, is so important. And let me start saying that, as we all know, is this replacement of the 100 billion. But one element that is really differentiating this new goal from the previous one is there is a clear indication that this goal has to take into account the needs and priorities of developing countries. Why? Because it was clear that the 100 billion fail, first of all, in not only in deliver the amount of money, but also in really getting to where it's needed. No, today the questions about where is that money are still in the table, and that's why we have to fundamentally think differently how we are going to build a new goal that doesn't repeat the same mistakes. But I think that one critical element that we need to debate, and we have to be very clear on this one, is if you think or if you ask the different countries and the different regions, what is the actual purpose of the NCQG? And you will see different approaches about this. And I think this is critical because there is a clear differentiation between what is Article 9 that Mikhail was mentioning, which is related to the provision from developed to developing countries. And there is this Article 2.1c, which is this idea that all the financial system has to be aligned to this low carbon development. And clearly, the NCQG was built on the context of Article 9, and of course, thinking in eventually all countries will, in a way, contribute. As our colleague was saying, there are a lot of countries already doing a lot of things at home. But this Article 9 is very important, because what it's telling us is that a lot of developing countries, most of developing countries, need this provision, this element from developed to developing countries, which is part of this historical kind of responsibilities that we cannot put outside of the table, right? And what I would like to say is that out of this NCQG, there is no other climate finance goal. So whatever we agreed on Baku will be very, very important for other processes. And let me mention two. The first point is that, as you know, we are going to, or many countries are starting their updating process of the NDCs, right? We know that the national determined contributions are these spaces to put, like, what are the priorities or what are the needs, as well as, what are the commitments that all countries are putting in the table. We know today that the NDCs are not taking us any close to the scenario of 1.5, right? So what is needed is to increase ambition of all these NDCs to arrive to a point where we can actually talk about the stabilization of emissions. What is gonna happen if these NDCs simply don't have money to be implemented? Because the NDCs have been clear in, we have to, there are activities that can be unconditional, actions that countries can do, and they are doing. But also there are a lot of conditional activities, because transiting towards a more sustainable development is not going to be cheap, and particularly for certain sectors. And this is the second point. COP30 is going to be very, very important, because we are going to discuss the global adaptation goal. And the adaptation goal is such an important piece to really, really embrace that we are in the moment that where climate change is a reality for all of us. And you saw in the US having this Milton hurricane and all this. So there is not a debate that climate change is here. So if we want to increase ambition of the NDCs, we need a clear pathways to implement them, because we can have the best NDCs, but if we don't have money, that's where the problem starts. And this is why the NCQG is fundamental, is instrumental to be able to increase ambition in the NDCs. And I'm telling you, I'm Mexican, so I could say, if I don't have those resources as a, as a commitment that I have the predictability, I have the certainty that I will have that money, it's almost impossible that we will be able to deliver like a huge ambition. Then you have other problems that are more fundamental than that. We are talking here about two potential layers, right? Like we are talking about, okay, we have to be very, very clear in what part of the NCQG, because as you remember, the 100 billion was a goal based on mobilization. And what mobilization means is a matter of interpretation, you can say. But this is precisely why in this NCQG, we have to be very, very clear in what is provision, what is the core, because that provision, that core, that has to be fundamentally public finance, mainly in form of grants, particularly for adaptation and loss and damage, is not going to be the same that mobilization. Mobilization can be other public interventions, other private finance mobilized through public interventions. Let's speak about the role of the multilateral development banks that have been increasing their flows, but it's not the same money. We are not going to need the same money for adaptation that we will need for mitigation. And that's why when we talk about the core, is very important. Let's discuss the core. Let's put a clear number in what is the money that comes from developed to developed countries in form of grants to support the main needs of developing countries, which are in adaptation and loss and damage. Then, as Makai was saying, there are a lot of things that we can discuss. As Joe, we have been also working in several pathways, several sources that can be part of the discussion. And we can start talking about trillions and trillions, because it's clear that it's possible to mobilize more money, because it's not a matter of there is no money. Yeah, there is money, but it's the matter is how you can transfer certain amount of money to the actual dealing with climate change. For instance, the amount of money that is going to fossil fuel subsidies, in war, in military stuff. I mean, money clearing is there, but a matter is how we are going to relocate. So I would like to conclude with two elements. So first of all, I think it's then very, very important that we have a clear pathway, a clear indication on how much is that core with this public money. And really that is the reassurance for developing countries to not only participate in further discussions, but also to have the reassurance. Because, I mean, we're talking about China, but China is one country. Like, if you consider all developing countries, like the amount of money that is needed is valued in 5.9 trillion, no, is what the standing committee is telling us. So we know that the NCQG won't solve all the problems. We know that. But if we don't have that core public finance, mainly grants for adaptation, and loss and damage, and transition, energy transition, just transition, it's going to be very difficult to have an scenario. The second element that for me is critical in these discussions is the transparency element, because we need a transparency mechanism to be able to determine how we are going to get there. Not only to track the compliance of this NCQG, but also the capacity to reassess, right? To review and to say, okay, this is the core, and maybe there is another layer, but we need to be sure that that core is delivered. No, we need to be ensure that the core is delivered, and we need to know where is the money. If we don't have that transparency framework, it's going to be very difficult to achieve. And let me tell you that the bigger the number, and the bigger the amount of sources, like if we, as Mikhail was saying, like if we put all different money there, the difficulty to track is going to be massive. So we can talk about trillions and trillions and trillions coming from all different sources. But if we do that, forget about the tracking process. So that's why we have to think in what is the money that we can track to ensure that that money is allocated in the precise space where we need it, that really responds to these priorities, and show the 21C will help us later to assess all that scoping that I'm telling you, we all developing countries have to get there. But this NCQ has another nature, and if we do not embrace that, we will be stuck. And I just want to finish saying that it is very important. It is very important that there is a decision in Baku. We cannot afford to delay. We have been discussing this for 3 years. There is no space for us to fail in this NCQG, this in Baku, because there is no guarantee that if we pass it to Berlin, we will get it. So I just want to keep close with that, because I think we all have to push to have the best agreement possible and ensure that that core is clear and goes to the heart of the problem. Thank you, Megan.
Thank you so much, Sandra. That was a very strong argument for making sure that Baku is a success. Our speakers I wanted to just let you talk because you've got so many valuable points to make, and that doesn't give us quite as much time for questions as I would have liked, but you've answered quite a lot of the questions that I had anyway. I just wanted 2 follow-up quick questions from me, if you don't mind keeping your answers as brief as possible. I know some of these topics are really dense and hard to answer very quickly. One question for Joe. I know you've done work on modeling and trying to assess, how one can get to the level of finance that's actually needed. On this core that we've been discussing, this core of public finance, how much is it realistic to expect that that countries could raise for this core public finance goal?
Oh, that's a hard one to answer in a short amount of time. But yeah, as you mentioned, last week, together with experts from ODI, German Watch, and Echo, we published a model that basically allows users to adjust various parameters to explore different ways that you can scale up international climate finance. Some of this is going to come from the quote unquote traditional sources that have delivered the 100 billion goal. So bilateral development agencies, multilateral development banks, and then of course on top of that is the private finance that mobilizes, although historically that hasn't been a huge amount. But one of the things we realized as we built out the model and we were kind of looking at, what are realistic growth rates for bilateral finance, and we looked at what the growth rate has been in the past decade. Bilateral finance, I think, grew by 7.5% a year. Multilateral development bank finance grew a bit faster than that. Multilateral climate fund finance grew at only 4.5%. So we sort of took that, and then we also, we sort of projected a business as usual scenario that would get to, 170 odd billion, just with developed countries meeting their current bilateral pledges and the current reforms to the MDB system. CGD published a piece that used a different methodology yesterday. They got to 200, but I think, that's the rough ballpark of like the no extra effort is that much. But then we need extra effort, right? I don't think anyone would say that we don't. And then there's that question of like how much extra, what levers can be pulled. The big takeaway I got from the model was that even if you were to assume very significant annual growth rates, doubling in 5 years, even tripling or quadrupling in 5 years, which frankly, I think for bilateral finance looks politically really, really difficult in the current environment. But even if you were to get that only gets you to about 200 billion or so, 300 billion. The MDB stuff on top of that can do a bit more. But I think that, our big takeaway was that if you just rely on the traditional channels, it won't get to the scale needed. And so what do you need? You need greater political will and you need greater citizen support. That includes deploying innovative mechanisms for raising finance, such as levies on polluting sectors like oil and gas, shipping and aviation. It includes further reforming the international financial institutions so that the MDBs can deliver more finance, that multilateral climate funds can deliver more and also quicker and make it easier to access, because that's the other key issue. And then efforts to sort of change domestic perspectives towards international funding in contributor countries, because that is a political block right now. And then, of course, using carrots and sticks to better mobilize private finance. So that, those are the different levers that we have in our model. It's designed so people can play around. All the calculations are transparent. So even if you don't like the parameters and you think that we can do more than a 15% annual growth rate, which is, double historic rates, you could go in and make your own model and stuff. But really, the idea was to sort of show, like, based on where we currently are and where we need to be, which is, hundreds of billions, trillions, how do we get from here to there? And yeah, my big takeaway was that we've really got to think about how do we have a step change and not just the incremental changes.
Maybe someone should design a video game with this as the as the challenge, and see what answers citizens throw up. Mika, I just wanted to ask you one follow-up question. How much do you think there's going to be a row at COP29 over whether there should be a sub-goal for loss and damage, for example, within the overall NCQG, which, as Lee said, is a horrific acronym, and I stumble over it all the time as well. Still, Mika, what do you think about loss and damage? Because it's a really important issue for small island developing states.
Yeah, absolutely. Based on there being no clear opposition that has been made on the floor to it, even though there was obviously clear absence in certain submissions, there shouldn't be a row, right? Couple of things. The needs and priorities of developing countries. It's quite clear from all developing countries, especially SIDS and LDCs, but all developing, I have highlighted, it's a huge need that has developed, especially over the last 3 years, right? To the point where we have clearly acknowledged it in multiple decisions of both the COP and the CMA. And so there's that. There's also now a dedicated fund for it in the financial mechanism of the convention and the Paris Agreement. So I find it very hard that a goal that talks to climate finance would not speak to the entire financial mechanism and only bits and pieces that maybe some countries may want it to speak to as opposed to others. And I think that's absolutely ridiculous. So, but I think that clearly means that there can be and there should be both from a moral perspective as well as just from the standpoint of practice that we have had as a COP and CMA of including it into the confines of climate finance, that there is a clear sort of sub-goal on loss and damage financing. That's very, very important for all developing countries, and no one has opposed it. So if they do oppose it, and they do oppose it in behind the scenes, I don't think that is operating in the best of faith, and it for sure wouldn't do them any pluses in the negotiation if they do that behind the closed doors. So maybe just drawing that line in the sand. We haven't heard much about it, but other than developing countries saying it needs to be in it, so it should be in. Thanks.
Okay, well, that's interesting. You say there hasn't been any public opposition to it. I wonder if that will come out of the closet at the last minute. Let's see. Right, so we don't have a huge amount of time we have a few questions in. So I'm just going to kind of gallop through the questions. One is a comment. And then whoever would like to sort of pitch in and answer them. There may be a couple that are quite detailed, so I'm not sure we're going to be able to do them complete justice. One is about the role of the MDBs and what they should be doing under the NCQG. How much money should they be aiming at providing, which Joe's model may be able to help with, and how can that be provided on better, i.e. more concessional terms to avoid worsening debt problems? And then there's another question from Jan Kowalczyk, who I know is also an expert on climate finance. He's asking, second question, should countries with responsibility and capability comparable to Annex II countries also contribute to provision of climate finance? So that's saying basically, should developing countries also contribute? And how would you word that to make it consistent with the Paris Agreement and avoid watering down of responsibilities of traditional rich donor countries? So that's some detail there on how the contributor base. And then a question for Mikhail: is it safe to assume developing a new narrative related to the global investment target is a way of shying away from rich countries' responsibility to provide public finance for the NCQG? I think you might have answered that one pretty much. So if anyone would like to pick up on those questions very quickly, Sandra, I think, is going to give us some insights.
Thank you so much, Megan. Yeah, I think there are many questions, very, very interesting. I will just address one and a half. The first element is that it's totally true that this NCQG is not only a number. No, it's very important to have that number because it's going to be the one that we will be able to track. But it's more important than ever to have those qualitative elements. And I think two elements that have been in the table for many, many years that now are part of the framework that the co-chairs came for, and I think are the critical elements that need to be decided are the access element, because what developing countries have been saying is like, yeah, we can talk about trillions here, but if we do not have mechanisms to access, this is going to be a failure, no? Particularly because we know that not all developing countries are accessing in the same way. And the second element is this element of debt, how to avoid that climate finance increases the debt. And this is related to the question that Jan puts in the table. That's why it's important to clearly differentiate what part is provision from developed to developing countries in form of grants that come mainly to address these issues that won't be able to access to loans, for instance, which is the case of adaptation and loss and damage. And then in the mobilization side, that can be the outer layer, then the role of the MDBs is going to be relevant because at the end of the day, they are the ones providing a lot of money in the regions. However, there are two elements that we have to consider. One is the NDBs at the end of the day are banks, right? What they are seeking is for return. And the role of MDBs, for instance, for the energy transition, I think is going to be important. But the role of the MDBs for adaptation is meaningless. The MDBs are not good in delivering money for adaptation. That's why we have to differentiate provision grants for adaptation from the mobilization side where the MDBs can play a role. But the second element is that now at the international level, we are talking about the reform of the financial institutions, including the MDBs. And if these NDBs are not fundamentally reformed, including a revision of governance and really mainstreaming climate change and the protection of nature in their portfolios, then it's going to be very, very difficult to give them more, more power. It's saying like, yeah, the MDBs will play a major role. Let's give them all the money if they are not fundamentally changing their operational system. So we have to debate as well and clearly differentiate what is provision from mobilization and clearly say, okay, if the MDBs will play a role, they have to fundamentally reform and mainstream these elements in their portfolios. Otherwise, we are empowering them when they are not delivering. And most of the money that they are providing to the countries is debt. And this is clearly, just to mention an example, like for instance, Colombia, 97% of their climate finance comes in form of debt. No, so and this is just an example. So I think it's important. Yes, their role will be important as long as they also commit to reform. Otherwise, we are just empowering a mechanism that persists and increases the problems that we are facing in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. Very good insight on MDBs. Mika, I'm going to go to you, and then I think we're going to have to finish off, unfortunately. I think we could have had a 2-hour discussion on this subject quite easily. But over to you, Mika, and then I'm going to turn it to Lee.
Sure. Global investment target shying away? Potentially. It potentially is. And that's how I kind of frame the discussion, at least, is that why is it coming in at the 11th hour right now? However, we want to operate on good faith, so we will try to operate on good faith on this and try and engage with it. And that's what we did at the pre-COP, right? Is to engage with it intellectually and see if it's actually feasible, right? MDBs. My note always on MDBs is there's a difference between reported climate finance and intentional climate finance. And we can unpack that for hours. But the issue with how the MDBs, I guess, their share of climate finance is more, at least as I've analyzed the data, it's more about looking at their current loan and sort of lending portfolio and attributing specific aspects of it as being specific to climate, noting even though they have the principles on that, there's a wide variety of approaches that the different MDBs use. And so talking about intentional climate finance through concessional arms like their development funds might be a more important way of addressing the issues on adaptation and loss and damage that Sandra highlighted, right? Because their lending is probably not ideal for adaptation, which is my last point on multilateral climate funds. They always get the flack about not being able to access complicated procedures. They only represent currently roughly around 3%. Joe, correct me if I'm wrong, right? 3, 4, 5%. And in that space, they have to understand that because they don't have a huge amount of funding, they have to find a way in which to close the tap a bit, to slow down the tap in order to make sure things go out continuously, as opposed to just getting all the money out the window. Which raises to the point, does that mean that we need to tell, similar to what the LDCs propose, where that the NCQG, about 20% of it, needs to go through the multilateral climate funds under the UNFCCC to give it that expanded kind of resources that are needed, which may then solve some of the access issues because they have more funding, right? Adequacy and access are part of the package. So I'll stop there. Over to you, Megan.
Thank you. Thanks, Mikhail. I'm just going to give the last word to Lee, just to kind of come back on any additional points throughout the webinar that you've heard, and perhaps to address, Lee, the question from Jan about, the fairness of everything and whose responsibility it really is to be paying up in this new world that we live in now, which isn't the same as, when the UNFCCC first came into being. And how do we come out of COP29 with a finance goal that is large enough and fair enough to everybody to be acceptable? That's a hard question, but I know you can handle it.
Yeah, well, I guess maybe just specifically on Yang's question, how do you, reaffirming the obligations of developed countries and the need that they need to take the lead. Also to encourage more contributions from other potential contributors. I think the trick again to do that is already in the Paris Agreement Article 9, as Yang also mentioned in the chat, 9.1, 9.2, 9.3. And I think if we write the final decision in Baku in a way that extends those key provisions and really capture the gist of all those provisions. In particular, when it comes to new contributors, 9.2 encourage, other parties are encouraged to provide or to continue to provide. I think that actually already highlights that some other parties are already doing this, right? So if you can craft a language to appeal to them, to encourage them more, I think there may be a way out. Again, on the basis of traditional donors, developed countries reaffirming the obligations that they have agreed with in Paris.
Thanks very much, Lee. I wish we had time to drill down into some of these issues more, but I'm afraid we don't. I guess what I'm taking away from this is that, our panelists have put really firm emphasis on the need to sort out this core goal, which is going to be predominantly public finance, which is absolutely most definitely going to go to help those countries that need it most, and that is the key thing that needs to be landed in Baku in order to facilitate the climate action that's so desperately required in the NDCs, and that perhaps when it comes to the wider global investment goal, maybe that some of that will come later, or, you know, there are still many things that need to be worked out between the relationship between the public core goal and the wider climate finance coming in there. But yes, it's still all to play for. And I just wanted to leave you with one thought, which was also an observation that came in via the Q&A. Which, you know, we've all been struggling with this NCQG business, the new collective quantified goal. The comment was, as Liam Mikhaev said, the word quantified is maybe doing a disservice given the importance of the quality of finance for whom, for what, and how. It's probably too late to change NCQG, but it's not the right title. I would argue that maybe it's not too late to change NCQG, and that perhaps we can come out of COP29 with a much better title, you know, something that really reflects what this is supposed to be doing in the real world, and that just is a lot easier to say, a lot prettier, and a lot more and a lot more fun. But yes, we shall be following the developments on the ground in Baku, and we'll be bringing those to you via Climate Home. And I should better let everybody go now, given that we've already stolen a few extra minutes of everybody's time. But just to say thank you so much for the insights from our panelists, highly appreciated. And we'll be continuing to talk to you all in the run-up to COP29 and through and beyond, because I don't think this issue is going to be going away anytime soon, even if we get the decision that we really want from Baku. Thanks so much, everybody, for speaking, listening, and generally participating, and see you soon. Thanks a lot. Thanks for now. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.